Okay. Good morning. My name is Kate Kirkwood, and I'm delighted to serve as your worship associate today. I'm speaking to you from the sanctuary of the First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa. We acknowledge that our campus is located on traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and that the work of reconciliation is a responsibility of our congregation and of all Canadians. Even as we slowly expand our activities in Ontario, we are still not gathering in person. So please take advantage of online opportunities at FirstU to stay in touch. If you are new to FirstU and would like to learn more about us, please contact us through our email at welcome@firstunitarianottawa.ca. Following our service at 11:30, do join us for our virtual hospitality hour. You will find the Zoom link on our website at www.firstunitarianottawa.ca or in our weekly email newsletter, the EUU. As we won't be seeing each other in person, it is more important than ever to sign up to receive the EUU, our weekly email newsletter. Check our Facebook page and our webpage for notices and updates. Our online calendar is as full as ever. I have announcements. We have named our new music director. After a competitive search with talented applicants, with input from our music search team, choir members, Reverend Pat and Reverend Eric, we are pleased to announce that Jen Berntsen will be FirstU's new music director starting August 16th. Jen holds a Bachelor of Music and Voice from Mount Allison University and a Master of Arts in Music and Culture from Carleton University, where her research focused on collective music making as a form of protest. We are excited for Jen to bring her experience, talent, creativity, and passion for choral music to FirstU. You can find more details about Jen's career and her background and follow the link to listen to some of her work in Friday's EUU. We look forward to welcoming her in August. We've received an invitation from the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition to assist in honoring Indigenous children. Tomorrow, on Monday, June 28th, the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition will hold a sunrise celebration starting at 5 a.m. outside Ottawa City Hall at the Marion Dewar Plaza on Laurier near Elgin. During the ceremony, a sacred fire will be lit until 1 p.m. All community members are invited to come offer tobacco and prayers for the Indigenous children who are being found across this country in unmarked graves. Elder Peter DeConti has agreed to light the sacred fire. First Nation, Inuit, and Métis elders will also be part of the ceremony and be available to speak with you. All Community Ottawa members are welcome, with a special invitation to Indigenous community members. And now our suggested Enviro action from the week from the Environmental Action Group. Use your green bin. For most people in Ottawa, it's the easiest way to compost and prevent the food waste in landfills from creating methane, a potent greenhouse gas. The green bin contents can include much more than food waste. Items like kitty litter, dog feces, and food-soiled cardboard. For better or worse, since 2019, contents may be put in plastic bags or liners. These are separated out at the waste facility, and of course, they go to the landfill. But in any event, composting is a win-win. It saves the city money, it extends landfills, and it's environmentally friendly. Environmental advocacy. Again this week, we encourage you to contact the Environment Committee of Ottawa City Council. Ask them to recommend to City Council that Ottawa join with 27 other Ontario municipalities in demanding that the province of Ontario cap greenhouse gas emissions at the 2017 level as soon as possible and phase out gas-fired power plants completely by 2030. You'll find links to a sample letter and email addresses in the EUU. Whatever your heritage, whatever your faith, whomever you love, and however you identify, today you are part of our spiritual community. Opening words, a poem by Melanie Davis, entitled A Spark of Hope. If ever there were a time for a candle in the darkness, this would be it. Using a spark of hope, kindle the flame of love, ignite the light of peace, and feed the flame of justice. Let us sing the Chalice Song.
Chalice, chalice, burning bright, help remind us with your light of how we'd like to live each day with love and truth lovingly the way.
I would now like to introduce our speaker today, Nancy Dyson Rubenstein, as Nancy will read the story for all ages. Nancy Dyson Rubenstein is a member of the Unitarian Fellowship of Ottawa. After retiring from a career as an early childhood educator, Nancy and her husband Dan wrote a work of youth fiction, Railroad of Courage. Their second work, St. Michael's Residential School, Lament Legacy, is a recollection of 4 months as childcare workers as a residential school in Alert Bay, British Columbia. By sad coincidence, their book was released just as Canadians learned about the unmarked graves of 215 children at the former residential school in Kamloops, BC. And now, welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Kate. I chose this book for the story of all ages today, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to see the pictures clearly. If not, there are YouTube videos online of this story. It's called My Heart Fills with Happiness, and it's written by Monique Gray Smith and illustrated by Julie Flett. They're both Indigenous artists in the West. And the book reminds me of spring and summer, and I love this joyous image. My heart fills with happiness when I see the face of someone I love. I smell bannock baking in the oven. I sing. My heart fills with happiness when I feel the sun dancing on my cheeks. I walk barefoot on the grass. I dance. My heart fills with happiness when I hold the hand of someone I love. I listen to stories. I drum. What fills your heart with happiness? I hope that this summer you're able to enjoy some of these same things that fill hearts with happiness. Thank you for listening.
Vernal clouds have turned the star wheel. Summer is upon us. Vernal clouds have turned the star wheel. Summer is upon us. Gliding o'er the hawks, hovering above the hot and yellow hillside. Vernal clouds have turned the star wheel. Summer is upon us. Crickets in the night, chirping in our ears, the sound of moonlit music. Vernal clouds have turned the star wheel. Summer is upon us.
This is the time in our service when we invite people to share their personal joys and sorrows. We do this by dropping stones in water and allowing the ripples to send the messages out to the universe where they can be received by everybody. I have a stone of caring, thinking of you for Caroline. Although we are nearing the end, I hope, of our COVID time, there are still people dealing with COVID, so let us keep those people in our hearts. There are not enough stones to cover the sorrow that we feel about the discoveries in the Indigenous residential schools. So I place a stone for all those souls lost and all those futures lost. And one last stone for all the joys and concerns held in the recesses of our hearts. We will now have a moment of silence.
Some words shared by Richard Wagamis in his book Embers. For you today, my friends, I raise sacred smoke. For you who are troubled, confused, doubtful, lonely, afraid, addicted, unwell, bothered, or alone, I raise sacred smoke. For those of you in sorrow, grief, or pain, I raise sacred smoke. For those who work for people, for change, for spiritual evolution, for the upward and outward growth of our common humanity and the well-being of our planet, I raise sacred smoke. For those of you who enjoy in the glow of small or great triumphs, who live in faith, love, courage, and respect, I raise sacred smoke. And in the act of all of this, I raise it also for myself.
Before I begin my talk, I have two announcements. The first is that the Truth and Reconciliation Action Group here at FirstU has asked me to invite congregants and visitors to donate to the IRSSS, that's the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and you can do that directly or through FirstU. The second announcement is that this book, which I co-authored with my husband Dan, will be donating the royalties to the IRSSS as well. The book has been hard to obtain in the last week, but the publisher asked for a second printing. The distributors are sending books out. They should be on shelves and online again this coming week. As Kate said, the release of our book came at a time that was a sad coincidence, came at a time when Canadians were hearing of unmarked graves, first in Kamloops, then on the Cowessess Nation, and I think we will hear of more graves, unfortunately. There's been a great deal of interest in the book, and we're glad because it means more people are reading the book, people are learning, people are eager to understand. The story in our book begins 51 years ago. In June of 1970. Dan and I were living in New York State. We were newly married and we wanted an adventure. We decided we'd head to the West Coast. My father said maybe we should take the train through Canada because the scenery was beautiful. So we headed north and then bought tickets on the Canadian Pacific across Canada. Our tickets were flexible, so we got on and off the train as often as we could and camped. Along the way, we met a lot of friendly Canadians. Many of them invited us to their homes for spaghetti dinners, and sometimes they offered us a night sleeping on a fold-out couch in basement rec rooms, all of which was a welcome change to me. I'm not a great camper. We were surprised by the friendliness and the closeness between generations. In the States, Dan and I had actively protested against the Vietnam War. We had experienced the polarization and unrest that was rampant in the U.S. In contrast, Canada seemed welcoming, open, benevolent, unified. So by the time we arrived in Vancouver, we decided we wanted to stay in Canada for a while. Friends told us we needed to get jobs to apply for landed immigrant status, so we pored over newspaper ads. One day in the Vancouver Sun, we saw an ad for childcare workers at the Alert Bay Student Residence, previously called St. Michael's Residential School. We looked for Alert Bay on a map and found it on a small island, Cormorant Island, between the BC mainland and Vancouver Island. We applied for the positions, and to our surprise, we were flown to Alert Bay at government expense. The administrator hired us on the spot, despite our lack of experience working with children and despite our absolute ignorance about Indigenous history and culture. Dan was to supervise 25 little boys from 5 to 8 years of age, while I looked after 18 teenage girls. The children went to public schools, so our work schedule consisted of looking after the children in the mornings, afternoons, evenings, weekends, and holidays. On our first day, our impression of Canada as a benevolent, multicultural mosaic was totally upended. The matron led us to a sub-basement where 4 children were delivered to her care by an Indian agent. The 2 little boys and 2 little girls stood mute and trembling while the matron cut away their hair and their clothes, and gathering it all up, threw it into the blazing firebox of the boiler. Dan protested, "Is this necessary?" The matron answered unflinchingly, "Lice. They all come in with lice." The children were terrified. 45 years later, we read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's executive summary and learned that what we had seen in St. Michael's that morning was not unique. Unfortunately, it was the kind of treatment that was rampant across Canada and had been rampant for over 100 years. The report reads, "It can start with a knock on the door one morning. It is the local Indian agent or the parish priest or perhaps a mounted police officer. The children were torn from their parents and hurled into a strange and frightening place, one in which their parents and culture would be demeaned and oppressed." Indeed, it was a strange and frightening place. The Anglican Church had had a missionary presence on the Pacific coast as early as 1819. In 1929, the Anglican Church in Alert Bay asked the federal government to replace an industrial school and boys' day school to build St. Michael's. The government agreed and built the school at a cost of just under $250,000, then transferred the property to the Anglican Church. 4 years later, the Anglican Missionary Society printed a pamphlet proclaiming the success of St. Michael's, and the language is very troubling. It says, "One is driven very quickly to one's knees in humble thankfulness to Almighty God for what has been accomplished. For a race of people brought in the shortest period of time known to history, from the most debasing savagery to citizenship, both in the kingdom of God and in this God-blessed Dominion of Canada." On that first day, I wanted to quit. On subsequent days, I wanted to quit and I wanted to leave the island. But my husband Dan was a bit of a warrior. He thought we could make a difference, and he begged me to stay just a little longer and a little longer. We questioned the other staff, and we were told that we were young and naive, and we didn't know anything about Indian kids. All of that was in fact true, but we did know instinctively that how the children were being treated, that was wrong. The administrator humored us as we knocked on his office door day after day to say how troubled we were by what we were seeing. He and the headmaster and the matron continued to tell us that the kids needed discipline, discipline, and more discipline. "They're Indian kids," they said. "They're tough." No one spoke of love and respect, caring and nurturing. There were times when the children were playful and happy, but those moments were eclipsed by episodes of harsh discipline and dehumanizing treatment. We reached out to the Indigenous community, asking people to help us understand. We learned that many of the children in St. Michael's were from Alert Bay, this tiny island, 5 miles by 3 miles in size, and we were confused. We had been told that residential schools were meant to provide education for children who lived in remote areas. So why were the children from Alert Bay at St. Michael's, and why didn't parents visit the children? Were they allowed to visit the residents? we asked an elder to take us to visit some families. In one home, a father told us that it was better that his son was at St. Michael's. George needs to live in the white world, he said. It's better he's raised by people like you. Look at me. I don't want my son growing up like me. He told us he had been sent to St. Michael's when he was 6 years old. He had run away a number of times, but had been returned to the school. Now he was a broken man who didn't know how to parent, to nurture, to love. A local United Church minister was worried about the children at St. Michael's. He and members of the Kwak community wrote a petition asking the federal government to visit Alert Bay to see what was happening firsthand. Although the churches still wielded considerable influence, the federal government had taken over responsibility for the Indigenous residential schools the prior year, 1969. We thought the government should be informed. We thought the Department of Indian Affairs should be held accountable. In December, a delegation from Ottawa came to the school. On the second day, they asked to meet with staff without the administrator. The senior official asked whether any of us on staff had any concerns. The other staff were silent. But Dan pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket. It was a list of concerns we had compiled with Indigenous members of the community. He read aloud, "We are concerned about the children's traumatic seizure and arrival at the school, suppression of Indian culture and language, lack of information about the children's families and backgrounds, lack of medical records, inadequate medical and dental care, lack of mental health resources for children and staff, poor nutrition, inadequate staffing, lack of connection between children and their families and the communities, frequent and harsh corporal punishment and humiliation." Before he could finish, the headmaster, Edgar, stood up. He was furious, and he sputtered, "Dan and Nancy should not be allowed to speak. They're not Canadians. They're not Christians, and they've only been here 4 months." Dan said, 4 months has been long enough to see what's happening here. There's a name for it, cultural genocide. Cultural genocide, that's what we were witnessing. You may wonder how we knew that term back in 1970. Dan's mother was an art historian, a social activist, and the daughter of a Unitarian minister. When we wrote to her and described what we were seeing, she was very concerned. She wrote to a family friend, Morris Opler, who was studying the effect of residential schools on the Apache people in the American Southwest. It was Maury who introduced us to the term cultural genocide. Dan was fired the next day. The administrator wasn't harsh. He said it was a bad fit, which was perhaps quite an understatement. It was an inevitable conclusion, and I was relieved. Dan and I moved to a neighboring island, to a community founded as a Finnish utopian society. The social fabric on that island was a sharp contrast to what we had experienced in Alert Bay. We tried to stay in touch with the kids at St. Michael's, but we saw them infrequently. We vowed we would continue to advocate for them, but we didn't. Dan and I regret that. We regret it very deeply. A few years later, in 1974, St. Michael's was closed. We believed the trauma had ended. We were wrong, very wrong. In June of 2015, with the tabling of the TRC reports, Indigenous people and others gathered at the Delta Hotel here in Ottawa. Dan cycled downtown and walked into the hotel. He saw survivors hugging and weeping. Memories came flooding back, and he was overcome with emotion. He shared an elevator with Rai Moran, who was then the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Dan blurted out that we had been childcare workers in Alert Bay, and Rai said quietly but firmly, "You need to tell your story." Dan promised that he would, and later I promised that I would too. We wrote our book in the hope that our story will provide contextual details to the survivors' stories and offer an adult perspective on what happened within one residential school. Too often, the survivors' stories of abuse, neglect, humiliation, their own powerful, powerful stories, have been met with denial. Too many non-Indigenous Canadians have dismissed what the survivors and their families have told us about the tragic and lasting legacy of the residential schools. One survivor said, "People tell me repeatedly to get over it. I wish I could. I wake up every morning and pray that I will, but I can't. I can't get over it." Dan and I are not victims, definitely not, but we had a taste of what it's like to be met with denial. As we worked on the book and told people about our experience, they often responded by saying most strenuously that the churches and the government had acted with good intentions. Now, I acknowledge that there were individuals with good intentions, but the institutions themselves, the government and the churches, were clear in their desire to eradicate the Indian right from the beginning. The residential school system was designed to take Indigenous children away from their families, destroy their identity, and make them white. I can't see any good intentions in that. Another form of denial we frequently heard was that the strict discipline the children were subjected to was common in other institutions, particularly in British boarding schools. But those British boarding schools weren't designed to eradicate the identity of the students or break the connection between children and their families. And no one has suggested that there are unmarked graves on the grounds of British boarding schools. In the thousands of pages of the TRC reports, a work of monumental research, it's all there. Extensive documentation about the inhumane treatment of Indigenous children across the country. Reports of poor nutrition, lack of fire safety, high mortality rates, and unrecorded deaths and unmarked burial sites. Reports that the government knew that they were failing in their own mission to prepare Indian children to live in the white world. Documents showing that the federal government wanted to close residential schools as early as the 1940s, but continued to fund them under pressure from the churches. The last school closed in 1996. After all of that, how can anyone deny the tragic legacy of residential schools? A legacy of loneliness, isolation, and despair for far too many Canadians. A few weeks ago, Phil Fontaine, the former chief of the Assembly of First Nations, said, "Canadians should have believed us. They had an obligation and a responsibility to do so. Canadians should have believed us." With the reports about unmarked grave, I sense a shift. I think non-Indigenous people are beginning to listen, not only to listen, to actually hear and believe. And I hope that that openness, that receptivity is not short-lived. Chief Dr. Robert Joseph of Reconciliation Canada says that the government, apologies, programs, funding are absolutely essential, but they're not enough. Real change will occur after thousands of conversations among ordinary Canadians. As Unitarians, we're fortunate to have a spiritual community where we can come together, learn together, where we can hold conversations, where we can initiate and sustain social action. We can expand the conversations, include Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, forming larger and larger circles in conversation with one another. I am hopeful. If we listen, if we believe, if we respect what the First Nations of this land tell us, I'm hopeful that we will find a way forward on a path to true reconciliation. I hope you will join us. Thank you.
For all that is our life, we sing our thanks and praise. For our life is a gift which we are called to use to build the common good and make our own days glad. For needs which others serve, for services we give, for work and its rewards, for hours of rest and love, we come with praise and thanks. For all that is our life. For sorrow we must bear, for failures, pain and loss, for each new thing we learn, for fearful hours that pass, we come with praise and thanks. For all that is our life. For all that is our life, we sing our thanks and praise. For all life is a gift which we are called to use to build the common good and make our own days glad.
This is the time in our service that we usually accept the offering. You may go to our website or contact our finance manager to find out how you might keep up with your pledge or make a donation. As Nancy mentioned today, if you prefer, you are invited to donate to the Indian Residential Schools Survivor Society. This can be done in a number of ways. You can donate online at the IRSSS website, or you can donate to them through FirstU by mailing a check made out to FirstU, Ottawa, but mentioning IRSSS in the memo section, by calling Michelle Jackson, our finance and HR manager, and giving her your credit card information, or by sending her an e-transfer at fm@firstunitarianottawa.ca and indicating it is for the IRSSS. We give these gifts freely. We receive these gifts gratefully. We dedicate these gifts to the work of the congregation, serving human wholeness, caring for the planet, upholding religious freedom, welcoming the stranger, loving one another. In closing, as I extinguish the chalice, let us all remember to walk gently on the earth and do each other no harm. Now let us sing Spirit of Life. Go in peace, go in love, go in joy, and may all be well.